After my bowling video, it was my intention to make some smaller videos on less intense, but still somewhat important topics. I actually had a few videos in mind, but then, Florida happened. A gunman opened fire on his former high school classmates in Parkland, Florida, killing 17 people. This shooting reminded me that in my bowling video, I did not discuss school shootings, and I really should have. This recent tragedy reopened the conversation about gun violence and gun shootings in America. And while I think this is definitely a good thing and something that is needed, I have a problem with the way the conversation is taking place. That's mainly what this video is really about. It's not an in-depth look at why school shootings happen, nor is it making the case for why school shootings are a problem. I don't think at this point that case needs to be made. Every time a school shooting takes place, I see the same arguments take place. And to put it mildly, every one of these arguments has significant flaws that I will be examining throughout this video. There are a couple of issues that prevent us from having an actual productive conversation when it comes to school shootings. One of those problems is the media's constant pushing of the corporate agenda and its favorite hobby of fear-mongering, exaggerating the severity and frequency of scary events. I talked about this in my mental illness stigma video. I used shark attacks as an example. So my question is, how often are school shootings actually happening? There has been a stat floating around on Facebook and on the news that suggests that there have been 18 shootings since the beginning of the year that has been roundly debunked by various news sources. That actually goes with my second point, and I'll get back to that in just a moment. One school shooting is too many. It's a problem, no question. But the severity of the problem should influence our response. If the media is exaggerating the severity, as I believe it is, our response in turn might be exaggerated or more extreme than what is called for. I believe the fear-mongering from the media and its corporate agenda is one and the same. They want us all scared because scared people do not make rational decisions, nor are they paying close enough attention to the things that they are getting away with, that the media and the people in charge would rather us not see? Secondly, stats on this issue are pretty much useless. The definition of what is considered a mass shooting is different when we are talking about the media versus the government, hence the aforementioned 18 shootings in the past year. Government standards, according to The Atlantic, have changed on what constitutes a mass shooting starting in 2008, making it impossible to look at the issue historically. No way to look at the year-by-year trends. Without a clear standard and murky stats, it's hard to have an informed conversation on the issue. Frankly, there is so much BS out there that it's really hard to know what's true anymore. When these tragedies happen, there are two main causes that people go to immediately. The first, people will say that we need to talk about gun control. I personally believe in reasonable gun control laws. But these laws in itself will not resolve the problem. If someone wants a gun, they will get a gun, legal or not. Just as if someone wants drugs, they will get drugs. Does that mean we shouldn't try? I'm not necessarily saying that, but I'm saying that this will not necessarily resolve the issue by itself. And those who go to the extreme, saying that we should just ban all guns, are not really being realistic. It won't, and probably shouldn't happen. But as I said before, I do believe in reasonable gun control laws, and for that matter, so are many responsible gun owners. What does that look like in practice? To To be honest, I don't really know. I'm not totally interested in having this particular conversation. It should be had, but by someone more informed than me. The other side says that it's not guns that are the problem. It's mental illness that needs to be dealt with. I'll admit that my original opinion was completely different than it is now. I got turned around after reading some articles on this particular issue. Since last year, I have become a mental illness awareness advocate and a proponent of the End the Stigma campaign, as anybody who's watched my videos, mainly the serious ones, would know. Our current president, Donald Trump, on the campaign trail, made exactly the statement that guns weren't the issue, mental illness was. And he's made similar comments in the wake of the Florida shooting. Back when he originally made those comments, I actually appreciated what he had to say. I am otherwise not a fan of his, nor any politician for that matter. But at the time, I appreciated his comments. Someone was actually taking mental illness seriously and bringing it into the national conversation. But after thinking about it and reading several articles on the subject, I came to see this very differently. This logic actually continues the stigma, which is exactly against what I stand for. It perpetuates the stereotype that mentally ill people are prone to violence, which is simply not the case. Actually, many of them are in no way violent at all. But alright, let's put that aside for the moment. Okay, Mr. President, you believe mental illness is a problem. What policy proposals have you put forth on this issue? Pretty much nothing. Lest you think I'm just beating up on Donald Trump because I'm not a fan of his, let's go back to the previous administration. President Obama talked elegantly, as he often did, about the need to deal with mental illness. But what did he do about the issue? He passed a gun control law that made it harder for people with mental illness to get guns. Now I know what you're thinking. Isn't that a good thing? Well, let's actually take a look at that law for a moment. The law states that people with Social Security benefits with psychiatric disabilities who are assigned a money manager for disability benefits would be reported to the gun registry as being ineligible to be able to own a gun. This includes people with mild mental disabilities and those who suffer from anxiety and depression. In this law, there is no need to prove that individuals pose a risk of harm to themselves or others. Again, this demonizes the mentally ill and seems unnecessarily punitive to people who haven't demonstrated that they pose any harm. I have anxiety and depression issues, as I've mentioned in previous videos. If I end up in this particular situation, should my gun rights be taken away, even though I pose no harm at all? I think that's a highly debatable point. And at this point, I'm not really sure there's many people left who don't suffer from some form of mental illness, diagnosed or not. This strikes me as an arbitrary way to take away people's gun rights. It should be noted that the ACLU and mental illness advocacy health groups both oppose this law. They argued that there are other groups of people that pose a greater danger to society that should have their gun rights taken away than the people that the law targets. To be fair to President Obama, he did pass the CURE Act, which was major legislation dealing with mental illness. It seems to have mainly dealt with medications, and the pharmaceutical companies were heavily in favor of the law. That alone makes me suspicious of the law, and makes me think that it really was not very effective in actually accomplishing anything in regards to mental illness. Perhaps you feel that the issue should be dealt with at the state level. Let's take a look at my state of Connecticut. Our Democrat Governor Dan Malloy made a proposal that cut $4.7 million dollars in grants for mental health and substance abuse services. While at the same time, speaking of the need to do a better job dealing with mental illness. Our politicians speak out of both sides of their mouths. They do things that accomplish nothing, but it makes it look like they are doing something. It's all empty theater. Every last bit of it. Democrats, Republicans, neither one of these people are your allies on any issue, let alone mental illness or school shootings. I have little to no faith in our government to fix the issue, regardless of which party is in charge. I may at some point do an entire video on exactly why our leaders suck, but I'm gonna move on for now. As with gun control, I do believe that mental health needs to be addressed in this country. The stigma needs to be ended, and we need to have an open dialogue on how to deal with the problem. That alone is a big underachievement. On top of that, I am certain that the bullying crisis contributes to school shootings. People will argue for each individual issue as the main cause, when in fact, I think it's a mixture of all three. And quite honestly, I think there are deeper things at play here that nobody is discussing. Let's talk about some of the proposed solutions that I continuously see pop up in the conversation. Let's arm all the teachers. I'm gonna be honest, whenever I hear this particular proposal, I start cringing. Some schools in Texas already allow this, and several states are considering such policies. I'm really not a fan. First off, I believe that teachers' jobs are supposed to be educators and not killers. And not for nothing, but there are plenty of teachers that I had in the past that would surely not be too excited about carrying a gun. Secondly, what happens when a teacher one day has a bad day and snaps and starts shooting up the classroom? Or what happens if a student gets a hold of this gun and starts doing a school shooting themselves? These are scenarios that we are all but inviting with these policies. At this point, we won't be able to trust the teachers, the students, or the people outside the building. That, as far as I'm concerned, is the end of public education. What parent is going to want to send their children to school under those circumstances? I know I wouldn't. I've heard the idea taken to the extreme that we should make guns and gun training mandatory for teachers. Schools are already having budgetary problems, so I'm asking, who is going to pay for the guns and the training? And how is that going to go over with 60-year-old Mrs. Brooks, making her do mandatory gun training and having her carry a piece? This is treating the symptom and not the main problem, and it's ridiculous on top of it. And then there's the idea of hiring former military or police to guard our schools. Again, I'm not a fan. It's more reasonable than the idea of arming our teachers, but still the idea has some serious issues. The first issue is a practical one. How are we going to pay for a nationwide armed security force that has to be in every school? Again, schools are having budgetary issues. They can't afford to do that. Is our government going to pay for it? Are we paying for it out of our tax dollars? I mean, we have a pretty large military budget, but some could argue we don't need to be quite as high, so maybe we can invest some of that money. But I'm pretty unconvinced that our government is actually going to do that. In addition to that, there would need to be some questions answered. For instance, are we just doing it for public schools, or are we doing it for private schools as well? What about colleges? And how much is this all going to cost? I'm guessing the number is going to be pretty damn big. Again, I ask, how often is this happening? How often are school shootings happening? How severe is the issue? You can't put a price tag on our children's safety. But if the problem is exaggerated by the media, we are not having a productive conversation on this issue, and we are going to the extremes more so than what the situation calls for. And lastly, it is already challenging enough to get our kids to go to school as it is. I mentioned in my bullying video that kids are already skipping school because of fear of being bullied. How much worse is that going to get when our schools resemble more prisons than they do actual schools? I think we need to take a good long look at our society and our culture. A deeper look into what our government is actually doing, what our media's agenda is, and the clear rot at the core of our society. I have come to see that our government is not our ally. It is in fact our enemy. It is very clearly working against us in many, many ways. And once again, I feel that this is treating the symptoms and not the main problem. You put any man under constant pressure, and that man will eventually snap. I think that's what's going on in our society. I think the system is putting pressure on people to the point that they're going crazy. And some of us are turning to violence. There is a big picture here, and we are all missing it. Until we put the pieces together and have an honest conversation and come up with practical, reasonable solutions, then incidents such as the one in Florida will continue to happen.